Different times have a lot of different ways to die. But which times were the deadliest in history? That's a good question for anyone who thinks they could move through time. For instance, will sneaking medicines into the country keep you from dying of the main cause of death in 1800? You could be taken to Florence in the 1300s or India in the 1770s. How fast would you die? It might not be possible to totally avoid diseases that almost wiped out all of humanity, like the Black Death. It's true that the plague changed everything. There were also diseases that not many people knew about but were still very dangerous. For example, the sweaty sickness of the Middle Ages could kill people in just one day. There are thousands of different reasons people have died in the past. What will kill you the fastest, though? Hint, it's most likely the bubonic plague. Which age do you think you could make it through? Pick the spot where you're willing to take risks and bet against the odds. Constantinople, 500s. In addition to being the wealthiest city in the world, Constantinople was also the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which would later be renamed the Byzantine Empire. Justinian, the great emperor, is responsible for bringing order and stability to the empire, as well as constructing projects such as the magnificent Hagia Sophia Basilica. The Justinian plague, which is considered to be one of the most devastating plagues in human history, swept across Constantinople in the year 542, resulting in the deaths of as many as 50 million individuals and as much as 40% of the city's total population. In spite of the fact that the initial assault was successful, the fact that outbreaks occurred over the subsequent 250 years was not very significant. As a result of the fact that the plague was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria that was responsible for the Black Death a few centuries later, any individual who becomes sick has a maximum of 4 days to recover from the illness. Florence, 14th century. You are in the beautiful city of Florence during the beginning of the Renaissance. Indeed, the dome that appears on the horizon is little more than a mirage. Brunelleschi will not finish constructing it for a few more decades. Enjoy, on the other hand, the opportunity to come into contact with intellectual giants such as Petrarch, and to witness the rise of the Medici family. Please be on the lookout for rats. It was the Black Death. By the time the first European outbreak of plague occurred, more than 60% of Florence's population had perished. Agnolo di Tura, a chronicler, wrote about mass graves that were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. He added, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands." The plague could easily kill someone in 3 days. As if that weren't enough, there were more murderers in the 14th century. When the Great Famine began in 1315 and continued for many years, it was responsible for the deaths of between 10 and 25% of Europe's population decades before the plague appeared. London, 1660s. London in the 1660s, such a beautiful place. The Civil War has come to an end, the monarchy has been reinstated, and everything is in order. Isaac Newton, a young man, is diligently working for his undergraduate degree at Cambridge, and England is largely at peace with the exception of that ridiculous little war between the Dutch and the English nations. Wait, do you detect any traces of smoke? In the year 1665, London was devastated by the Great Plague, and if your home became infected with the disease, you might have only 4 days left to live. During a single summer epidemic, a staggering 15% of London's population went away. But even if you make it through the epidemic, there is a strong probability that you will be killed by the Great Fire of London in 1666. In just a few short days, 80% of the city was consumed by fire. Consumption and cough were the leading causes of mortality in England throughout the middle of the 17th century. Probable causes of death include the plague and fire, which may seem too biblical. Ireland, 1840s. It is the 1840s, and you are now located on the stunning Emerald Isle situated in Ireland. It is true that the British continue to treat your island as if it were a colony rather than a member of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. In addition, Ireland is not doing particularly well economically. On the other hand, why don't things turn around? 1845 was the year when the Irish potato famine occurred. In one of the most severe food shortages in the history of modern times, 1 million people would perish as a result of starvation and disease over the course of the following several years. If you did not perish from starvation, there was a significant possibility that you would contract typhus or another disease that would ultimately result in your death. Typhus can be fatal in a period of less than 2 weeks, whereas starvation is a painfully protracted death. There are as many as 2 million people who have permanently left Ireland. It was because of the severity of the famine that Ireland's population in 1920 was still lower than it had been in the year 1800. North America, 1600s. In the year 1600, North America. There is a cool breeze blowing through the trees, the rivers are clear and glittering, and they are teeming with fish. Oh, and look, who is going to be aboard that enormous ship? As European settlers arrive in North America, particularly in the vicinity of Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay, where English settlers would swiftly wage war against the Native Americans, life is about to undergo a profound transformation. The bad news is that when indigenous Americans were first exposed to European diseases, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, the indigenous people died at a rate that ranged somewhere between 90 and 95%. It wasn't until the 1600s that the disease made its way to North America. Between New England, a smallpox outbreak claimed the lives of 70% of the indigenous population between the years 1633 and 1634. Infected individuals were burdened with excruciating blisters that, when popping, quickly disseminated the disease, resulting in the deaths of individuals within a span of 12 days. China, 200s BCE. Thank you for visiting China in the 200s BCE. After what seemed like an eternity, the Warring States period, during which multiple kingdoms struggled for control, has finally come to an end, and the Qin dynasty has pledged to bring Beijing peace. At the same time that the first emperor of China has pledged to implement changes that would make China a global power, there is a sense that something is not quite right about the way he is looking at the world. Qin Shi Huangdi, the reforming emperor of China, was also involved in the construction of the Great Wall of China. However, he utilized a significant amount of forced labor. One story suggests that just a few tens of thousands of individuals survived the construction of the wall, despite the fact that as many as 1 million people were sent to build it. On the Great Wall, fatalities might occur in a very short amount of time. If a fall did not take your life, famine and mistreatment were always a possibility. Moreover, it is true that the emperor constructed the terracotta warriors, but he also buried approximately 500 intellectuals alive. The battle may have been over, but the policies of the emperor caused a great number of people to lose their lives. France, 1910s. France during the Belle d'Or, sometimes known as the Beautiful Age. Since the 1870s, the production of industry has increased by a factor of 3, and new technologies like as telephones and streetcars have brought about a permanent change in people's lives. It should come as no surprise that the sales of alcoholic beverages have increased by a factor of 3 during the past few decades. It is quite unlikely that any issues will arise as a result of any of those mutual defense relationships. Greetings, and welcome to the 20th age. To a large extent, you are going to perish. There were 41 million people who lost their lives as a result of World War I during the years 1914 and 1918. That includes 1.4 million deaths in France and over 4 million casualties in total. French soldiers who went off to battle had just a 25% chance of returning home without being injured. However, if you were fortunate enough to escape the war, the Spanish influenza was responsible for the deaths of up to 300,000 people in France and infected up to 500 million people all over the world. 50 million people could have perished. India, 1770s. You have arrived in India, which is governed by the British. Since 1757, the British East India Company has exercised sovereignty over Bengal in addition to controlling a significant portion of the subcontinent. It is true that the British have pilfered the Bengali treasury, and it appears that they are just concerned with making a profit. However, what could possibly go wrong with a corporation that was in charge of a colonial empire during a time when shareholders were given the opportunity to vote on the policies that were implemented? Hunger is the leading cause of death in the world. In the year 1769, the company chose to disregard the drought, and by the year 1770, people were famished. The Great Bengal famine ultimately resulted in the deaths of 10 million people, which were equivalent to 1/3 of the population of Bengal. The populace was weakened by malnutrition, and illnesses such as smallpox continued to destroy it. In the midst of the catastrophe, the company increased the land tax and formed a monopoly in the grain trade industry. Even though millions of people lost their lives, it was a tremendous time for earnings. Between 1765 and 1777, the profits of the corporation doubled. Ancient Rome, 1st century. During the Golden Age, you find yourself in the exquisite ancient city of Rome. In spite of the fact that Augustus may have unlawfully grabbed power and brought an end to the Roman Republic, things aren't looking all that bad in the 1st century. Currently, construction is underway on the Colosseum and the Pantheon, both of which will serve as enduring monuments to Rome's illustrious history. What could possibly go wrong? You were unfortunate enough to arrive in ancient Rome during the summer, which is sometimes referred to as the sickly months. Although Rome may be experiencing a golden age, this does not prevent contagious diseases from spreading throughout the city. Malaria, TB, typhoid fever, and gastroenteritis are the most deadly diseases that occur during the summer months. These illnesses can cause death in as little as a few days. Infectious infections are responsible for the deaths of at least 30,000 people every summer. Also, if you are able to survive the diseases, you should avoid going out at night because there was a significant amount of criminal activity on the streets of Rome. Virginia, 1860s. You have arrived in Virginia during the 1860s. As a result of the Revolutionary War, Virginia has become an important battleground in the conflict between the United States of America and the Confederacy. This is not a good moment to be a resident of Virginia. Even after the South surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia continued to experience the impacts of the war. Richmond, which served as the capital of the Confederacy, was where the majority of the fighting took place, and a few of them were lethal. During the 1860s in Virginia, the civil conflict was not the most lethal event, since it was responsible for the deaths of as many as 850,000 people. However, the conflict did contribute to the spread of a particularly hazardous disease known as malaria. The endemic disease, which is transmitted by mosquitoes, is estimated to have killed more than 50 billion people throughout the course of human history. It normally manifests less than 10 days after an infected bite. Margaret Humphreys, a historian of medicine, contends that the Civil War pushed hordes of men into the swampy areas of the coastal South and along the major rivers, who then took the parasite home with them. Humphrey's argument is supported by other sources. It was reported that more than 1 million people had contracted malaria during the Civil War alone. Philadelphia, 1790s. Your arrival in the nation's capital is greatly appreciated. It is true that from the years 1790 to 1800, the capital of the United States was located in Philadelphia because Washington, D.C. was still being built. The war is finished, and the United States of America is now a sovereign nation. At the same time that Philadelphia is growing, President George Washington has demonstrated consistent leadership. On each and every corner of the street, there are signs of prosperity, but there are also a few dead bodies. Hello there, where did you get those from? The fever yellow. Because of trade with the West Indies, a disease that was once prevalent in tropical regions and was transmitted by mosquitoes plagued the nation's capital. The symptoms would first include weariness, fever, and jaundice. Nevertheless, the sufferers would soon begin to experience bleeding. As soon as you started throwing up blood, you knew that the end was drawing near. Typically, the death rate from yellow fever is between 7 and 10 days. In 1793, Philadelphia, a city with only 45,000 citizens, was stricken by a massive outbreak that resulted in the deaths of 5,000 people. Also, if you were fortunate enough to survive, You might want to think about leaving Philadelphia during the summer because yellow fever made several appearances in the 1790s. Britain, 1850s. During the 1850s, Britain saw a transformation because of the introduction of steam, coal, and industry. In the early years of her long reign, Queen Victoria is still in her early years. On display in the Great Exhibition of 1851 is the prosperity and luxury that have been brought about by the process of industrialization. Put all of the youngsters who are working in factories out of your mind. Without a doubt, there are drawbacks associated with industrialization, but the introduction of spinning machines, chewing tobacco, and fake teeth at the exhibition more than make up for these drawbacks. During the time of the Industrial Revolution, the death rate decreased, but the lives of industrial workers were not particularly happy. At the Manchester Infirmary in the year 1833, 40% of the cases of accidents occurred because of factors. On the other hand, the factories were nothing in contrast to tuberculosis, which was also known as consumption, and was one of the most significant killers throughout the Victorian era. In the year 1851, tuberculosis was responsible for 1 out of every 4 deaths that occurred in Europe and the United States. The disease may take many months to kill a person. The deadly disease also had an effect on fashion trends, as the enormous skirts that were popular during the Victorian era were considered to be a source of tuberculosis bacteria, which led to their decline in popularity. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.